interesting audience for this one. Who here has heard of cultured meat, out of curiosity? Excellent. Oh, wow, that's I'm very impressed. So cultured meat is an emerging technology where instead of producing or raising animals and then slaughtering them for the production of meat, we isolate the cells that are responsible for repairing muscle, fat, and connective tissue, and then store those, place them in an environment that mimics being inside the animal, and then allows us to grow muscle, fat, and connective tissue in order to create food. That's the underlying technology, and there's a lot of companies that are working on this. Our approach at VOW is that we don't believe it makes sense to try to replicate what we eat today, eating things like beef, chicken, and pork, or the industries behind beef, chicken, and pork, and other mainstream proteins have a several thousand-year head start on us. Instead, we believe if we're going to create sustainable behavior change for consumers, we have to offer things that are very distinct and better than that. And so we're starting off by producing animals that we could never farm. There's a lot of really interesting historical records that talk about things like tortoises and dugongs and other species that we could never domesticate and how delicious they are. Cultured meat unlocks that, and it solves the two biggest issues of alternative protein, which is it's typically more expensive at the beginning, and it's very, very difficult to match exactly the sensory performance of a beef, chicken, or pork product because everyone in this room is an expert in beef and know exactly how it should taste and feel. So rather than trying to replicate, offer things that are different. And then ultimately sort of use this library of different cell ingredients from a wide range of species to craft food experiences which are tastier, more nutritious, and more functional, that are ultimately sold as brands, not sold as the animals from which they're derived. So that's the long-term vision, a new category of food which looks more like the cereal aisle than the meat aisle, with lots of different brands to eat in lots of different scenarios, that consumers are making the change selfishly rather than on the basis of sustainability and ethics. They're choosing products that better meet their own needs and own personal goals. So kind of we're the crazy ones in an industry, the cultured meat industry, that's already full of completely crazy people.
I started in conventional agriculture in sheep, and now I'm a maggot farmer. So the general joke is that I started a maggot farmer, I ended a maggot farmer, just the location where the maggots were is different now. And I spend a little bit more time wishing they'd stay alive than I do wishing them dead. So it's never imagine you'll start how you finish. You'll finish how you start. I entered the insect protein industry looking for alternate protein for livestock feed. We understand the challenge of producing enough protein to make enough protein. There's enough slideshows at conferences now to know that story. The longer I farmed insects, the more I realised that you cannot create new protein from existing supply chains. So I can't take bran and feed it to mealworms because bran already has a supply chain into conventional agriculture. And Australia is a canary in the coal mine on the availability of waste streams for feed in bad times, right? So there are farmers who walked down the food waste supply chain in the 80s drought and never came back. Brewer's grain, confectionery waste, milk products, whatever. So I recognise the need to utilise actual waste streams, not wasted agricultural wastes, which is generally what people feed insects because it's considered safer, and because those waste streams don't have a home per se. So food waste from this event, for example, potentially can go to the anaerobic digester right here in Sydney, but likely it will be unable to be processed there because of its contamination. So there's this huge supply chain of waste that can feed protein that we aren't utilising, but the challenge of waste is logistics, which ironically is the challenge for intensive farming in the transportation of food. So I recognise that if we were going to farm insects using a new supply chain of feed, being waste, that we couldn't replicate an intensive farming model, which is also replicates a landfill, which is a large central place from which we truck heavy things to feed it, whether we're feeding a landfill, feeding an anaerobic digester, or feeding an intensive poultry farm. So we've designed autonomous systems that are modular, stackable, and deployable. They are designed to manage food waste, and we can process food waste from super clean stuff like grape mark all the way through to the waste that's coming out of households and biosolids, so effluent. We have a factory in Canberra, and we process upwards of 40 tonnes a week there. We have a unit deployed into Barangaroo down Tower 2 in Darling Harbour, and that manages the waste streams from the 3 towers there. And that's sort of the evolution of creating circular economy. So we are an intensive farm that can be deployed as close as possible to the waste stream that feeds it, making protein in a regional way. So we sort of tipped the entire thing on its head, but kept it the same in an interesting way. So that's the focus of what we do. And it is both waste management and protein creation. Our protein goes to livestock feed, however.
Right, so V2 is a tech company, came out of CSIRO about 2.5 years ago, founded with venture capital from Main Sequence, which is the CSIRO venture fund. The founding story, which I think is true, actually, I just heard Phil Morrill, who's from Main Sequence, actually say it again, is that Jack Cowan wanted to import the Impossible Burger into his restaurants, and they ignored his emails. And so he was at a dinner with Main Sequence and CSIRO and say, we're pretty smart in Australia, can we do something about it? There's this opportunity. And the science and the technology was available, if you like, or there were certainly some very bright scientists and technologists, but they needed somebody to take it out of the science realm into a business, and they asked me if I would do that. We founded on the 17th of January 2019. I was in San Francisco at the time, and it was then that I realized that the problem to be solved wasn't to turn the world into vegans. It's actually to double the amount of meat that we're producing on this planet, because that's actually what we're going to need to do. So it kind of framed how we approach the problem. It's about reducing meat consumption globally. And we think that Australia is in a great position to convert and add huge value to the pulses that we produce in Australia. And when you do the maths, it's really, really compelling. As the world gets wealthier, they eat more meat. We're kind of genetically predisposed to like meat. And what happens is, as you get wealthier, your meat consumption goes up. And so if you take China 30 years ago, it would have been sort of 10 kilos per person per year. 4 years ago, when Xi Jinping said we need to halve the amount of meat consumption in China, it had grown to 50 kilos per person per year. Since then, it's grown another 10 kilos, so it's now 60, and Hong Kong is 130. So if you want to multiply that by 1.3 billion people, and then you think, how could we possibly grow that amount of meat? You run out of land. Globally, there is nothing left, the land that could be used. So get rid of all land, all Amazon, all biodiversity, everything, and you've run out of land. So that's the existential problem that we're here to solve. What we believe is that there's no point in asking people to do anything that they don't want to do. People aren't going to do this for environmental responsibility or even for nutrition, even though there's some really positive reasons why that's a good thing to do. They'll do it because the meat is delicious, and it's affordable, and it's available, and it goes into the dishes that people know how to cook. And given you only know how to cook a few things. I mean, I was R&D director for Master Foods, and the frustration was you couldn't get any consumer to do anything other than eat the dishes that their grandmother used to cook them. And that's pretty much, we only know how to cook a few things. So the job to be done is have meat that's affordable, available, and delicious in the sort of meals that we want to cook and we want to eat. And that's our mission. We've come a long way in 2 and a bit years. Our strategy is to be number one in Australia so that we can be very much part of the Australian meat export story. As you all know, 3/4 of Australian meat is exported. The thirst for meat around the world is insatiable. And our job is to be part of that supply chain and to export around the world. And we're already exporting more into Asia than we are selling in Australia, even though we're doing pretty well in Australia as well. So technology is key to this. Making plants taste like meat is not easy. Job one is to make sure it doesn't taste of plants. Yeah, simple really. So one of the things that for us is really important is that we actually have our own protein extraction capability in Australia. I didn't do my due diligence very well when I started the company because I thought that I'd be using Australian protein for this. The reality is no one's doing any processing in Australia of any scale that converts Australian grains and pulses into Australian protein. So we're going to have to build that infrastructure, and that's on our agenda as well. And then we can have the whole supply chain from Australian farmers sequestering carbon in the soils, growing pulses, and we can convert that into meat. And when you do the maths, we could make 5 times more meat in Australia if we converted it from pulses than what we can do from possibly ever grow from animals. So what a huge value opportunity it is for Australia.
I started off with a vegan grocery store and restaurant in Brisbane. And from that, I realised that the future was in the supermarkets. So I partnered with Woolworths about 2 years ago. And our plan was to bring products onto the market very quickly. We weren't doing the sort of innovation that these guys are doing. We were finding products that already existed in the market and packaging them for the mainstream. One of our biggest places for finding these products was Malaysia. So we went into the Malaysian market and found the seitan products, repackaged them for the mainstream market and put them into and we've grown from that point into I think we're one of the largest in Woolworths protein suppliers. So, and we do a range of mayonnaise, cheeses, and ready meals. So our business is sort of very consumer focused. We decided that we wouldn't go into the innovation. We wouldn't invest in factories to begin with. We would get products onto the market first, and then back end into the manufacturing space, which is where we're at the moment.
So George, back to you for a sec. You're at the very early stages in this cultured meat business. Tell us a little bit you did tell us a bit how it worked, but in terms of getting that cell culture in the first place and why you're starting with some of the more exotic species.
Olympia's reaction is about right. So we start off with an almond-sized biopsy from an animal. We take a biopsy of muscle, and then we essentially digest that to have all the individual cells that we can store and we can keep coming back to. In most countries, or in some countries, we can take that from a live animal, but in Australia it's quite difficult to do that, and so we're predominantly working, somewhat ironically, with animal processors locally. But internationally, other companies are taking those biopsies from live animals. In theory, if everything works and our quality system is where it needs to be, we can take that biopsy once and essentially use that indefinitely to be continually producing meat from those cells. Exotic animals have 2 advantages. One is what I mentioned earlier. It's much easier to persuade someone to pay $200 for a, say, dugong nugget than it is for a chicken nugget, which is roughly what that's the sort of price point our early products are going to be. There's really no reason that anyone's going to pay that sort of money for chicken, beef, or pork, but there's really good reasons if it's an exotic animal you otherwise couldn't eat. The other advantage is a kind of a weird one in that growing cells outside of an animal is really tricky. In fact, when my co-founder was introduced to me, which ironically was Nick who introduced the 2 of us, he called me and he said, I really want to do cultured meat. And I was like, do you know anything about cell culture? He's like, nope. I'm like, let me tell you all the ways that growing cells outside of an animal is really, really, really tough. There are some species which grow really well in cell culture, and they're not beef, chicken, and pork. And so if we're looking at this sort of building this broad library, there are going to be these kind of workhorse cell lines that just produce lots of really good quality muscle protein that are going to come from sort of unusual animals that we don't think of, that are going to become a really strong foundation for us to build food experiences on top of. And so that's the other advantage of exotic animals. We get to find the fastest growing and cheapest to produce cells on the planet.
Fair enough. Olympia, now you're chair of the Insect Protein Association of Australia as well as Goterra. So how many companies are we talking about in Australia? What sorts of insects? And are they targeting direct human food, or are they aquaculture and chickens and things like that, and then to humans? Yeah,
the industry has grown significantly. It's now valued at over, I just looked at it, over $6 billion now by 2025. You're looking in Australia at an industry that is still in its nascent form, but you can understand an industry's maturing when you look at what's happening up and down in the supply chain. So you're starting to see not just farmers, but also technologists that are building infrastructure or software to farm insects. So you consider we took a couple of 100 years to domesticate the cow, and then sort of in the last 100 years we've automated its milking and we've created sort of technology around that. Insect Protein's done the same movement in about 10 years, and so you've got a lot of people wanting to come into the industry but have no way. Starting a conventional animal farm, a couple of DPI pamphlets, a few field days, you kind of get it sorted out. Insect farming, we get calls all the time. How do I start? I'm really interested. And it's like, here are some links to some people doing stuff in their backyards on YouTube, and we wish you all the very best. So that's a really big challenge to get people to come in, because what you're essentially saying to really excited people is you all have to be a startup. So we have it's now 15 commercial entities that exist as operating businesses, another 25 that sit in what you would call R&D or prototyping phase, and then we've kind of got sort of 40 interested people, which are generally people that are doing stuff in their backyards or garages. And then that's on the feed side. On the food side, we have over 20 who are farming insects for human consumption, but we're also starting to see companies that just deal in product. So we've got some people that are just doing FMCG, some who are looking at powders and other things like that. So overall about 150 plus members, but coming from academia and all the rest. There are a lot of research projects out, particularly for human consumption, because there's some validation around quality assurance, processing regulation and things like that. People need to qualify. What is the shelf life of a cricket? Yeah, don't put it in the sun. It's those not good things to write on macro brands going into Woolworths. So there's some work to be done, but that's any industry really.
So Cale and Nick, most of us have probably eaten the types of foods that you're talking about. So Cale, vegan food is seen by some as the extreme end of that process, the non-meat spectrum. But you were saying, when I was talking to you earlier in the week, it's actually been around for quite a long time and is probably a little bit more prevalent than some of us think.
Yeah, I think the reality of the stuff, our Plant Asia range, which we sell into Woolworths, has been manufactured for centuries in Malaysia. So the seitan process that's become topical in media recently is gluten flour that is flavoured in certain ways to create a high protein product that is delicious, yeah. And it's been around in Asian grocery stores for centuries. So what we did was just bring it into the mainstream.
Okay. And so Nick, you were talking about processing. Should people be worried about the amount of processing to make plants look and taste like meat rather than plants?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's funny, when I was at Master Foods, what you had to do was go to kitchen cupboard ingredients and basically tell people this is exactly the same as your grandmother used to make. And to a large extent it was, a jar of dolmio, what's in there? It's tomato and herbs, and the processing is you put it in a jar and you warm it to a temperature which is way lower than what you have in the pan when you cook it at home. So yeah, it's processed food. But is processing bad? I mean, obviously there's a reason why we have big brains. It's because we learned to cook food, and cooking food is processing. So the reality is, and I don't make an apology for it, but our grandmothers didn't know about plant-based meat. It didn't exist. It requires some science to extract the proteins, but it is no artificial colours, flavours, preservatives in that sense, but it is processed. But the reality is that if we were all on a global scale to eat the foods that our grandparents ate in Australia, and we multiplied that by the amount of people on the planet, we don't have the resources to do that. We just cannot physically do that. So the job to be done is to design food solutions which actually meet our needs, because we're not going to be reducing our population anytime soon. So yes, it's processed. Is it healthy? Yes, we're doing lots of nutrition projects with Syro to demonstrate that it has all of the nutrition of meat. And then it has the positive things like fibre, which we are chronically short of in our diets in Australia. So that's good. And we do everything we can to make sure it's sustainable as well. So yes, it's processed, but I don't think that's a bad thing. I've spent my life doing work in food companies, and I don't quite understand what the problem is with processing food. We've been doing it since we've been humans.
Ben Waters from FTI Consulting. Just interested, obviously plant-based meat. Does it need to be called plant-based meat, or should we be calling it what it is?
What is it?
What is it? when you buy a 500 grams of mince in the supermarket and you cook it in a spag bowl, what are you cooking? Yeah, look, it's difficult. I have genuinely tried. I've been in Canberra for a day talking to the politicians, and I was told by a PR consultant, don't ever mention the word meat. It's really hard to not mention the word, because that's kind of what what we're trying to do is something that looks the same, tastes the same, fits in your daily habits in exactly the same way, because if we don't, there is no way this is going to get big. So that's the job to be done. What do we call it? We're very clear that we do not pass it off as meat. It's plant-based, it's clearly labelled. We've got very, very strong rules about making sure that it's very clear. There's no evidence of anyone ever picking up our product and thinking that it was meat or being confused. So there is actually quite a strong group that's saying you should not call it meat. In the same way that in France, you shouldn't be calling milk, plant-based milk. I believe that's now being rejected, I think, in the European courts. There's no confusion. And from my perspective, this is not about destroying the meat industry. The Australian meat industry is going to thrive. There is way more meat that needs to be created. Australia can't produce any more meat, really, than it's doing at the moment. And everything that we produce, we export anyway, pretty much. So we're not about destroying the meat industry. We just need to grow more meat. And if it's plant-based, we can grow it. If it's animal-based, we can't grow any more. So.
Totally agree with that. And from my perspective, it's about ease of articulation. The job is to make it less confusing for consumers, and by using terms that people understand to explain things that they can see in front of them, it makes it easier for consumers to try these products and go from there.
Just for clarity, I mean, in the shops you'll see V2 mince, V2 burgers, V2 sausages. We don't say V2 beef or V2 chicken, so we're not passing off. We're just saying what it is. It's mince, burgers, sausages.
We do that. But the companies are called Made with Plants and Plantasia, so we make it very clear.
There's no confusion.
My question is, do you have any stats on adoption rates, like how many people are converting from meat to plant-based?
Yeah, well, it's funny. Again, it's about reducing meat consumption. So we're targeting what we call these flexitarians, and it's more than 50% now. Actually, we could probably do it. I do this all the time. How many people, how many vegans in the room?
One.
Yeah, no, that's good. Anyone tried to be a vegan or vegetarian sometime in their life? Yeah, it's pretty hard, isn't it? Yeah, I've tried. That's me as well. How many people are reducing their meat consumption? Yeah, that's it. It's always more than 50, and normally it's about 70%. Reducing meat consumption, and now it's about making sure that the product delivers against your needs, because you're not going to pay more for it. Yeah, and if you buy it once and it doesn't deliver, you're not going to buy it again. You've got to buy it where it's available. You're not going to go across the street to a niche store. You're going to want it in Coles or Woolies or in your Hungry Jack's or in your McDonald's or whatever. And if you do all of that, then you'll buy it. And so that's the job to be done. And it's a big ask, but that's the journey that all of us are on, pretty much. And then this will become a really big part of people's diets in Australia, but particularly abroad, where there's an enormous demand.
Just to continue on to that, the current situation at the moment in Australia is very tenuous when it comes to flexitarian buying into this space. The income problems that have come from COVID, people being out of work, has affected people's decision making when it comes to. So the flexitarian space that's buying into this market, and we're totally focused on them as well, changes very quickly. So we're in a space at the moment that is not stable. So our market share moves around constantly, and more so at the moment.
So Olympia and George, where are you seeing insects and cultured meat fit in that percentage of the market, say 10, 20 years down the track? mainstream, not mainstream?
So it's interesting. I have because I don't know, maybe because I come from conventional ag, and I honestly, in 1994, if you'd asked Olympia what we'd be eating in 2021, I would never have said maggots would be on the menu or that plant-based meat would be a thing. And there is a part of my unconscious bias that kind of rolls my eyes sometimes, and I'm like, really? Now here we are. But the truth of the matter is, it ends up coming down to the future you believe we're looking at. And I believe that the effects of climate change will continue to affect our agricultural industries to produce food. And if that is true, then regardless of whether we have nostalgia around what the word meat means or milk means, we are going to care very little about that when the production capacity of our food is in jeopardy. There's a researcher at UQ that says it, and I love it. The statement is, these feelings and associations to what we will and will not eat are full belly problems. They're decisions that we reject because we have the privilege to do so. And so when we think about the reality of harsh climate causing challenges, I think our ability to adopt new things will start to adapt because our privilege will be shifted somewhat. And so I think there will be a range of opportunities to eat a range of different things based on socioeconomic availability. And I think that we are doing ourselves a disservice to discredit any of them. And I think about it more in the context of regular food. In the 80s, sushi was not a thing. Like we were like, no, thank you, no. And we've had evidence of that happening over and over again. Quinoa hit the market. Everyone's like, what the hell is this thing? We can't pronounce it. We can't cook it. I've cooked it for 12 hours. It's still crunchy. My stroganoff is like liquid now. And then we're like, oh, put it in a muffin. Now it's a thing. So I think we just have to kind of get over some of this stuff a little bit. I don't want to eat maggots anytime soon. People tell me that maggot ice cream's delicious. That's great. But I do very much want to be participatory in an agricultural industry that creates diversity. From my perspective, Australian farmers are well advised to look at insect farming because they require less than 400 millilitres per kilo of protein produced, no sunlight, and you can do 300 kilos of protein per cubic metre. So from my perspective, if you want to drought-proof a farm, then you need to get some insects and just let them hang out in there, because why not? You could destock your whole farm and never feel the pain because you would be producing protein in a shipping container in the tractor shed. So I just think we have to kind of let the reins go. The Kelpie, the four-wheeler, the dream is still there. It'll just be a bit different.
George, Nick keeps saying that you don't eat what your grandparents didn't eat. So depends on what country you come from for what you're trying to produce. What do you think in terms of the amount of market share?
So a couple of decades from now, I think cultured meat is going to be mainstream basically everywhere. Obviously biased in this, but I think you're going to be able to walk into any supermarket in the world and have a number of different cultured meat products and brands available to you at likely far below the cost of conventional meat today. Where I think it's going to be the most mainstream is countries that have very limited arable land and net food importers. Even in the case of plant-based, is you still need that plant-based input, and there are some countries like Australia which have incredibly large tracts of arable land compared to our population. There are countries like Singapore and Korea and Middle Eastern nations, as well as parts of South America, where especially in climate change, they're not going to be able to feed their population. So being able to take a very simple sugar, which can be produced through a whole bunch of different systems or imported, and convert that into protein right where it needs to be consumed, those are the countries which benefit most from that, are going to be the ones where cultured meat is the most mainstream. And so I think it'll be mainstream everywhere, but it will probably be the dominant protein source in parts of the world that are the most food stressed.
There's a question up the back.
So Scott Bouvier, KWM, just on cultured protein, how have you started to lay the path for getting it regulatory approved from a novel foods point of view, and how receptive have FSANs been in terms of looking at what you're about to do and trying to sell?
This is a big question. So cultured meat is a novel food, so we're not allowed to sell it until we have approval from the local regulator. Food Standards ANZ is the Australian New Zealand regulator. They are satisfied that we can go down the novel foods pathway, which is an established pathway to introduce it. We're not focusing on Australia as a first market. We're focusing on Singapore. They've regulated the sale of cultured chicken from a company called Just. They have a very, very clear framework, and we're working with them as we develop our own quality management and safety systems. So we're at a point where we're targeting this time next year for the submission of our full safety dossier to them, and then following that, within about 3 months, we expect regulatory approval for sale in Singapore, and the timing of launch after that really comes down to when we're producing at a scale that makes sense to sell. But the Australian regulator's certainly been very receptive and very consultative, but Singapore is definitely the furthest along on the planet when it comes to regulating.
Hi, I'm curious about insects. Yep. And I'm an artist who worked with termite nests. We have been in Colombia in the past, and we were eating their big ants, which was a delicacy in Colombia. I remember once when I was at a TEDx event in Sydney, they had insect-based food. But I'm curious about insects in terms of food. So what kind of, George was talking about exotic animals for cell-based meat. What about exotic insects or insects in general you're thinking of in terms of protein food?
Yeah, so Australia cracks it out of the park here, and I think that's what's really interesting. There's currently a PhD project with CSIRO that we're partnered with around insects for human consumption from the Australian landscape. So if you get onto Dan Murphy's, you can buy green ant gin. I don't like gin, but it is actually very good gin. Green ants are like the most beautiful citrus flavour on the planet. It's such a clean taste. It's incredible. And they're so small, but they pack this incredible punch. And so those insects are very popular. Bogon moths are really looking to be a very commercial-ready insect. High meat content because they're quite big. It's meat. Don't laugh. Right. They're very fat. We're going to be at the show one day and I'll be like, Bogon 273 now, walking the arena.
If they were upset.
She's a sappy young moth. Nice spring in the back.
If anyone is upset about the plant-based stuff being called meat,
yeah, that's right. They can't be upset about an insect being called meat because it is meat.
Yeah, the plant-based stuff's pretty good right now.
Not at all. And the EBVs on a moth are way better than a cow. Anyway, so yeah, we've got bogon moths, which are a really interesting one. The witchetty grubbers are difficult. It's like the most desired because it's caviar of the insect world, but feeding witchetties in a commercial sense is quite difficult because of the life cycle. But there's just an absolute range in Australia. Cockroaches, it's so... The culture connection to cockroach is really hard, but cockroaches, woody cockroaches are actually really nice. And so if we can shift some of the cultural perceptions, there's Australia's really strongly positioned for some really cool stuff in the insect space that would be unique unto the world. And I think that's what we do really well in agriculture in Australia is take unique things, grow them, raise them and produce them in ways that have a unique Australian feel to them. They're clean, they're green, it's purposefully done. So I think there's something really unique there, for sure.
All right, one more question before Robert gets his go and we wrap up.
Robert's been waiting for a while. Daryl Anderson from Anvil Media, and this is a question for George. Looking at the idea of cultured meat at scale and developing it to being a rival in volume to, say, on a global scale to the Australian red meat, or let's say the Australian meat industry, not merely red. What does that look like in terms of resource use, its footprint, both in terms of water use and space and smell, dare I say it, or whatever? What does that look like? Is that an ugly, ominous thing for cities to be producing enough cultured meat for themselves?
Oh, it's a good question. So, who here is familiar with the Tesla Gigafactory? the biggest building on the world. So Tesla's building this mega gigafactory in the middle of nowhere in Nevada. They're building another one in Germany, another one in China, another one in Texas. And the first one is set to be the biggest factory, the biggest building ever. I think it's 1 million square meters. It's enormous. But to give you a sense, if we had one factory that size, we'd be producing around 2.5 times the volume of the whole Australian red meat industry. So yes, it's a really big building, but it's a single building and we can produce a hell of a lot of meat in it. We're designing our entire process to have essentially zero waste. There will be a very limited waste stream of what's essentially super concentrated salt water, which is what the cells excrete as they grow. It's basically urine, to be honest. That's one of our main waste streams. And then beyond that, we're trying to eliminate all single-use components from our large-scale manufacturing process. So water, energy, sugar, salt, amino acids come in, and meat and a little bit of brine basically comes out. And so it could be something which is on every city block, sort of following Olympia's model, going for a very decentralised approach. It could be something where we have one factory in Western Sydney that is then trucked around Australia. That's an open question for us, and we're trying to form a view on whether centralised versus decentralised manufacturing is better for cities, better for people, and better for the food that we eat.
This has been fantastic, and as you've been talking, the Green Ant Gin was given away as a prize last week at Food Futures in Darwin. I didn't win it, sadly, but I might go and buy a bottle. In our blurb for this event, we said, book now to hear from some of the companies taking on the livestock industry to provide the protein in our diets. And I was talking to Tony Marr at the NFF the other week, so we're having this panel, it's great. And he was saying how he chaired a panel recently with the livestock industry about how they look to the opportunity, and he said they just couldn't get it. So my question is, how do you all play nice with the traditional red meat sector so that everybody wins?
I'll take this one. I just don't believe that it is a competition. And that comes back to my initial discussion. In a world where the climate is unpredictable and we have 3 years of great rain and then mice and then suddenly 5 years later it's a drought again and we're all stuck, I just don't think it's a zero-sum game. So that's number one. From an insect perspective, I don't know about the gentleman to the left and right, but we are integrated. So I very much want to be backed onto the end of a dairy, onto feedlots. I want to handle morts. I want to handle effluent. And we want to take that protein and push it back into aquaculture and poultry so that we can free up some of the supply chain of plants going to feed protein and push them into other things. I think that's how you create circular economy and have your cake and eat it too.
I'm happy to. So I can't do what I do as far as our supply to Woolworths without the milk and dairy industry, the dairy and meat industry. We work with JBS, we work with Beacon Johnson on things at the moment. We process our vegan cheeses at Real Dairy. We're using the infrastructure already and working closely with the meat industry to push things forward. I don't think it's a competition. I remember when I first arranged the first mince, vegan mince, into Woolworths, we were looking at sales numbers and we were hoping for 10 units per store per week, and the meat industry sells about 100 units per store per day into this space. We're sort of right at the start of this. We're not a competition to the meat industry at the moment at all. It doesn't need to be a battle. It really isn't. Yeah.
No, I mean, the meat industry exports the majority of the meat. The price of meat is sky high. It will increase. It's happy days for the meat industry. The world is desperately short of meat. There's no way we could ever supply. We work with the meat industry. Our partners are the meat industry. There is really no competition. I guess it's the fear of change, and anything that's new sort of feels scary, but the economics are so compelling. If you just think that you could take a commodity crop of $500 a ton or $600 or $700 a ton. You can turn it into meat at $6,000-7,000 a ton, and you can actually make twice as much meat per ton as you can from the grain. So it's incredibly, the value for Australia is enormous when you do the maths. And if we export all this into the countries that are for more meat because they're growing their meat consumption. The economic opportunity for Australian farming is enormous, but there needs to be some investment in order to make that happen. But imagine that a meat industry 5 times the meat industry or more, grown from Australian pulses and grains. It's just the most wonderful opportunity for Australian agriculture to get on board, and the meat industry will grow and increase its value as well.
When it comes to the types of meat production systems that we want to take with us into the future, Australian extensive grazing is the best that it gets, especially as we start to move into more regenerative systems. So there is always going to be a demand for animal meat. Australian farmers should continue to produce animal meat and sell it at a higher premium. I have no interest in that. What I do have an interest in is making products that are going to displace intense factory farms in nations that have much less regulation about the quality of those farming systems. And I don't think there's anyone in this room or in Australia really that's going to go, yeah, more really disgusting factory farms in unregulated nations is what we all want to see. And so I think we're all kind of on the same page here. And yeah. I think this is an unusual alternative protein panel in that 3 out of 4 of us are meat eaters as well.
Cale, I need to know, insects, cell-grown, would you eat it?
Cell-grown, definitely. Insects,
Thank you.
I'm not sure.
Is it based on sentience or gross factor?
Gross factor,
Yeah.
Absolutely good.
We're working on it.
But cell meat, I would definitely eat it, and I have eaten it. Yeah. So
I want to eat a dugong. Was it a dugong or a... Yeah, Galapagos turtle?
Working on it.
That sounds really evil.
Please give a round of applause to our panel.